Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Cap Times Idea Fest. I'll give this another, 30 seconds to a minute or so for folks to trickle in. It's exactly 6 p.m. now, so give it a couple seconds here. Wonderful. So as I said, welcome to day 2 of Cap Times Idea Fest, where we're spending 6 days and over 24 virtual and in-person sessions with 80 speakers talking about the state of change in Wisconsin. So my name is Allison Garfield. I cover local government for the Cap Times. And I am so pleased to be here moderating this panel on Wisconsin's Jewish experience. We have 4 all-star panelists here with us, comprised of community leaders and scholars, to talk about the experience of Jews in Wisconsin and in Madison, both past and present. So here we have, we'll start with, we have 2 Jonathans, so that's a little confusing, but I'll start with you, Rabbi Beitch, who holds a master's degree in Jewish communal service and also Hebrew letters. He has served pulpits in Virginia and California before joining Temple Bethel here in Madison. Next, we have Professor Jonathan Pollock, a history teacher at Madison College and an honorary fellow in the Mose Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies at UW-Madison. He researches histories of Jewish economic niches and Jews in higher education. He also authored Wisconsin, the New Home of the Jew, 150 Years of Jewish Life at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Next, we'll go over to you, Alan. We've got Alan Klickman, the Executive Director of the Jewish Federation of Madison. Alan received his bachelor's degree from Connecticut College and his Master of Social Work from Yeshiva University. He is also a licensed transitional life coach who grew up in New Jersey and lived in Israel for an extended period of time. And lastly, we have Hannah Rosenthal, former CEO of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. Hannah's long career in public service includes leading the U.S. State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism during President Obama's administration, serving also as the Midwest Regional Director of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services under President Clinton, and leading the Milwaukee Jewish Federation until her retirement in 2018. She is a former rabbinical student and graduate of UW-Madison. So there's all of our panelists there. I'd like to thank our sponsor for this panel, Forward Theater, for their support. One of the reasons we landed on this topic is because of Forward Theater's current production, The Wanderers, which is about 2 very different Jewish couples exploring the same question of whether happiness lies in what they have or on the road not taken. I won't give any spoilers, so if you want to learn more, the production runs through September 25th. Before we dive in with all our panelists here, who you really came to hear talk, I'll briefly tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Allie, and I am Jewish. I was born and raised in New York, in the suburbs, just 30 minutes outside of Manhattan. I came to Wisconsin, to Madison, to study journalism at UW-Madison, and I've stuck around since graduating in 2020 to cover various aspects of Wisconsin politics. I now cover local government for the Cap Times here, mainly focusing on the city and county. I was so excited to do this panel because I've long been interested in Wisconsin's Jewish history and experience, mainly because my great-grandmother, who fled Poland ahead of World War II, emigrated to Wisconsin, actually. Phyllis Dresner, my great-grandmother, fled by herself to the United States, leaving most of her family behind. And they were Jewish and died in World War II. But my great-grandmother ended up in Milwaukee. And to me, that was always just, kind of wild and crazy. I've always been told that I have, this big Wisconsin family, most of whom I've never actually met. And, I just, thought it was really cool that I ended up in a place so close to where my great-grandmother lived, and met my great-grandfather, who was a local boxer in Milwaukee. And they had my grandpa, and they moved to California. But it's not too surprising when you think about Wisconsin's long history of Jewish community and culture, spanning back, to the first organized Jewish community in Milwaukee in 1844. So we're going to hear all about that from these folks here, along with what Judaism looks like today in Madison and across the state and in the upper Midwest. So let's begin. To start, I'd like to know what Wisconsin's Jewish experience is to each of you. So, Rabbi Beitch, would you mind starting us off?
Sure. Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and to my colleagues as well. I think the Wisconsin Jewish experience for me as a rabbi, coming here, having been raised in a very large city, I'm from Los Angeles, serving cities in communities rather, in Washington, D.C., and in a very small rural area in Virginia. Coming to this wonderful mid-sized city, it's simply allowing people to live their Jewish lives in as authentic a way as possible. And when I say authentic, I'm not talking about, Reform, which is what I practice, Reform Judaism, or Orthodoxy, which is what our other colleagues and friends practice, but simply the whole range of Jewish religious and cultural expression. And Jews have been here for many years, in Madison, certainly. So being here is a pretty authentic experience, I think, as far as I'm concerned.
Wonderful. And Professor Pollock, would you like to care to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the things about Wisconsin, where it's even like a little awkward to talk about like a Wisconsin Jewish experience, is that it looks really different depending on where you are. To be Jewish in Milwaukee, Milwaukee is it's a pretty large Jewish community. There's what I would call a big Jewish infrastructure there. There are Jewish day schools. There are kosher grocery stores. There's a big Orthodox community. So it's growing up in Milwaukee would be much more like growing up in Cleveland or Indianapolis or other cities of similar size with similar sized Jewish populations. Madison's Jewish community is quite a bit smaller. And Madison is where my whole Jewish experience has been in Wisconsin. I've been here since 1990. And Madison is one of those cities where a lot of people have come in from elsewhere. Conversely, Milwaukee is a city that people return to generation after generation. My son went to the JCC camp run out of the Milwaukee JCC Camp Interlochen. And he, his friends had the same last names as people who were like big shots in Wisconsin Jewish history 100 years ago. They were like their great grandkids and so forth. Madison's not quite like that. There are a few families that have been here for multiple generations, but a lot of people move here, like you, Allison, to go to college, to go to grad school, to get a job here. And as Rabbi Beitch said, they find they like it and they stick around. So as a result of that, the Wisconsin Jewish experience I found is very much, you kind of build up a second family here. That if you get involved Jewishly and, along all the diverse lines that Rabbi Beitch mentioned, if you get involved Jewishly in some fashion, you find out that the friends you make that way become your kind of surrogate family. That lots of people I know here, lots of people in the Jewish community, their families are still where they came from initially, or they're somewhere else. But this sense of family is one of the things I think is really great about my Wisconsin Jewish experience, at least.
Wonderful. Alan?
Welcome, everybody. I want to begin with something that Jonathan just said, Jonathan Pollock, which is you have to look for it. My experience coming to Madison, Madison is the smallest Jewish community I've ever lived in, without a doubt. I grew up in and around New York. In New York, everything's Jewish. Even non-Jewish people are Jewish. The supermarkets all carry Jewish food. Everywhere you go, it's Jewish. People of color speak Yiddish words. You take it for granted. And then we came here to follow our daughter who moved to the area and be close to her and close to our son in Chicago. And what we found was a community that's so much richer than its size. I mean, there's a Reform synagogue, conservative, Reconstructionist, Chabad. We have a Hebrew preschool here. We have a combined community-wide Hebrew high school. We have a Jewish day camp, which not only serves the Jewish community, but the non-Jewish community. There are 750 children or more that go through the camp every summer. So for me, the difference is in a community of this size, you have to seek it out. But if you're ready to seek it out, then as Jonathan said, you meet people who become family, and you find here that there is a wealth of Jewish experience to envelop you.
Great. And Hannah?
Well, my background, I'm a rabbi's daughter. My father was a Holocaust survivor. And that's who I am, and that's the lens through which I look at all my experiences. So coming to Madison, I came here the summer between my sophomore and junior year in college because I had decided to become a rabbi. And this was one of the only schools that had a mamash Hebrew department. And I came here and decided not to go back east to my small all-women's college in Massachusetts. And I got to know this woman on my first day of fall classes. Helen Schwarty was her name. And she came up to me and she said, "I heard you were Jewish." And I said, "Yeah, I'm Jewish." And she felt my head and wanted to know how I got rid of my horns. And she said it with great earnestness. Not evil, not terrible, but that's what a Jew was to her. So I knew I was in a different place. And connected through Hillel, but not a lot, because I also was raised with Reform values. And at the time, the Hillel was very Orthodox. And so that was not home for me. But Madison became home as soon as I started realizing who my close friends were. It was not intentional on my part. But I looked around and all my closest friends were Jews. And that was the case where I was growing up. But being part of the rabbi's family, one would expect that. Not here in Madison, where the Jewish community is so small. I love Madison. My kids loved growing up here. They went away to college on either coast and came back here to have family. And so I appreciated that. And when I retired, I came back because I wanted to be near my grandchildren, if truth be told. But Madison is a very rich, multicultural community. Now, I have 2 grandchildren who are biracial. And so given the climate we're in, the political, religious, you name it, climate we're in, I worry for them because I know they're going to have a solid Jewish upbringing. But I don't know how the Helen Schwartys, who want to know where my horns are going to be dealing with them. And that's what keeps me up at night, is how open is the Jewish community and how open is the community at large to the various Jews that are around them. And I think that's a challenge for us.
Absolutely. And before we kind of move into the Jewish experience today, I want to look back a little bit about, Wisconsin's Jewish history a bit. And perhaps I'm particularly interested in this because of my great-grandmother, but, there was a major emigration of European Jews to Wisconsin and to Madison in the 1930s and 40s. as refugees from Hitler's Europe. And, some ended up in Madison or Milwaukee. And so I'm wondering a bit about, the implications of that today, whether that's in the state or locally here. Professor Pollock, would you start us off with what we can take away from that history and how that's led to the Jewish experience, I guess, today?
Yeah. So, the Jews who came to Wisconsin in the 1930s and 40s, it's a really interesting group because there was quite a bit of, they were real diverse about how much of their Jewishness they wanted to hang on to once they were here. One of the things, people who fled ahead of the Holocaust, or certainly who fled after, really had the whole range of reactions to it. There were some people who said, all right, we got out alive, we're done with that. And I've met people here in Madison and elsewhere in Wisconsin who they find out when their grandparents are on their deathbed that their grandparents were Jewish, that their grandparents came from Germany or from Poland or somewhere, or Czechoslovakia, and they hushed this up forever. Once their grandparent revealed their Jewishness, they understood why, that grandparent might not have been the most enthusiastic at Easter services at the church that they went to, but they still went and they still kind of buried that as long as they could. And then on the other hand, you have people who, came out of Europe and said, all right, it is our duty now. We got out. We have to keep the Jewish people alive. And I think in Milwaukee more than Madison, because Milwaukee has the community that Madison doesn't, that people who fled Europe were instrumental in kind of rebuilding the Orthodox community. That Orthodox Judaism, in a lot of ways, in the 1930s and 1940s, scholars of Orthodox Judaism and Orthodox Jews themselves kind of look at that as sort of like a low point. That there were a lot of people who belonged to, or were nominally Orthodox. They belonged to an Orthodox synagogue, but they didn't really keep kosher. They drove on the holidays. They weren't really into it. And the people who came in from Europe sort of refreshed that. The people, again, who had this idea that because they had survived, they were going to regenerate Jewishness in the United States. In Madison, there's a fairly small number of people who came through. There might be more than I know of, because I think Madison also, as a smaller community, and Madison also in the 1930s and 40s was much more of a small town than it is now. Just not just numerically, but it just had more of a small town kind of mentality. And Madison has become much more urban, much more sophisticated, just in the 30 years I've been here. There was the Deutschkron family are the ones who I think of as part of this generation in Madison. They started Maxwell Street Days on State Street, the big bargain sale and stuff like that. That was their baby. They had several different stores in the area. But yeah, that group was relatively small in number. I think also as later immigration kind of took place through the efforts of social service organizations. And not through the kind of strictly family connections that brought people here, in the early 20th century, at the turn of the century. That then were able to, if they were placed in Madison and it didn't work out for them, they could say, well, I don't want to be here. Can you get me to New York? Because that's where my family is. And I want to be with them. Or my family's in Chicago, or my family's in Atlanta, or wherever. And the agencies often could say, okay, we can make that happen. And even if they didn't, you get in your car and drive. You call your cousins on the phone and you say, can you find something for me down there? And then you leave and go. So that's my sense of it. I don't know. Hannah, we're talking about, my family was over here 50 years before yours, from the sounds of it. Maybe you've got some perspective on this that I lack.
Can I try it the other way?
Go ahead.
When I was traveling, which is what my job was at the State Department, to point my finger where there were incidents of anti-Semitism. And what became a joke, other than, how bad I was at technology, was the fact that I would say all roads lead to Madison. And so I'm in Lithuania. Not a good history there for the Jews. And Lithuanians didn't like to hear that from me. They kind of are like some of the people in Florida who can't teach what they want to teach because it might make someone uncomfortable. Well, that was my job, making people uncomfortable. And I'm at the ambassador's home, and I look at a beautiful painting that is of pastoral, like farmland. There are a couple cows on it. I said, oh, that reminds me of home. And the ambassador said, really? Well, it's between Madison and Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. My family owns a farm. And this is a picture of the farm in the middle of Lithuania, going back to that. I'm in Poland, and one of the many museums in Poland, they are changing some of the language underneath some of the pictures, trying to change history and say that they fought the Nazis when they didn't, and that, you know how history gets turned around. And I said to the man, where did you learn your history? And your Jewish history? He says, well, I'm Jewish, and that shocked me. And he said, I went to the University of Wisconsin at Madison and was a Mossy student, George Mossy. So here we are. You know, it's like everywhere I went, the imprint of Jews in Madison was everywhere. And so I came back to the States thinking Madison had not only become more cosmopolitan, as you said, Jonathan, but I thought it had grown by leaps and bounds, because I was finding it in South America, I was finding it in Europe, I was finding it everywhere I went. So the other side of that is people come here sometimes for the university and for learning. But what happens during that experience gets exported around the world, and it's pretty exciting. And I want to say one more thing. Obviously, George Mossy was very important to me also. When I came here, I became a Mossy student. He was a profound man. And so was Harvey Goldberg, who many people came to University of Wisconsin, even if they weren't students, just to sit in his class. We always had amazing stars here that proudly wore their Jewish hat. But there were still many of the students that thought we had horns. And I did graduate a long time ago. I'm old. But my guess is there's some people maybe in Ann Dursey's farm between Madison and Oconomowoc, where people from that area would wonder if we have horns.
Well, I see a question here in the chat. I was wondering if either Hannah or Jonathan or whomever really, for folks who aren't who don't know who George Mossy is, can you maybe just give a brief background on that?
Did you study with him, Jonathan?
I didn't. No, he had just retired before I got here. But yeah, so George Mossy, actually, Allison, he ties back to the question asked a few minutes ago. Mossy was the first Jewish professor in the history department at UW-Madison. He was a Holocaust refugee. He was from a wealthy family in Germany who managed to get him to England during World War II. And then from England, he came to the United States after finishing university there, started out at the University of Iowa, and then Madison brought him, UW brought him in the early 1950s. So a big part of Mossy's, Mossy's appeal, like his ability to teach 20th century German history, was that he had lived it. His family were they were in publishing in Germany, so he had this upbringing where he was close to all these major figures in German society in the 1920s and 30s. And he was, as Hannah said, I mean, Hannah, for people of your generation, everybody know who was here. It's like they took Mossy, they took Harvey Goldberg, like everybody took him. Mossy also was, as I mentioned, he came from a great deal of money. He didn't have children. His family was able to They're one of the Jewish families who was able to kind of sue the German government for reparations and to get what had been taken with them from them back. And it's George Mossey is one of the two people for whom the current Center for Jewish Studies is named. He's a generous benefactor for Jewish studies while he was alive, and in his estate afterwards, he's set up lecture series. There are scholarships in his name. There's exchange programs with Hebrew University in his name. So yeah, really, and the whole humanities building at UW is named after him now. Which is kind of like ironic because he hated the humanities building. Those of you who've been in there know it's the rooms run hot and cold, and there's no air circulation, and it's hard to find your way around. And Mossey just thought it was a terrible thing, and then they slap his name on it. I don't know if he angered to make that happen, but the building is named for him, and it reflects his stature at UW-Madison.
Wonderful. Well, somewhat related. In my experience, and I feel like this ties a bit in with your anecdote, Hannah. A lot of Wisconsinites that I've met since moving here haven't known too much, honestly, about Jewish history or culture or the religion itself. When I was a sophomore here, I started as a sophomore, I transferred. But when I had a Wisconsinite roommate who I love to this day, but I was the first Jewish person she had ever knowingly met, and that was just like kind of mind-boggling to me at the time. She didn't see if I had horns, but she knew nothing about Judaism, or when I would go to temple on the high holidays, had dozens of questions about like what are the holidays and that type of thing, and that was really strange for me coming from the New York suburbs, where there were lots of Jewish kids in my elementary school through high school, and it was just never even a question. So the things have evolved. I think there's kind of a theme there. So I guess, Alan, I could throw this one to you, but I guess where does that stem from, and how do you advocate for Jewish people, in Madison or in Wisconsin, in a place where, the population is so unevenly dispersed?
Well, I think one of the challenges that we have in this community, whether you're talking about the Jewish Federation that I represent, or synagogue, is that we don't have a Jewish neighborhood. We are spread out. We like to say, I think, or I was told when we came, that the Jews live west of the campus. But in fact, we know that that's not the case. There are 250 children registered for something called the PJ Library, which is a national system that sends books to children's home. And there are as many children registered on the east side of town as the west side of town. So that's one of the challenges that we have. And I think the answer is that for a community our size, it sometimes feels like we provide even more than necessary. We provide even more experiential things, whether they're religious, social action, programming, than other communities of our size. Because we're so spread out, we want to make sure that we touch everybody. One of the elements of the summer camp is that we provide bus service, because we take care of people who literally live 45 minutes from each other. It's a big distance when you're talking about summer camp.
If I could jump in too, I think that, I think that there is a long time. How can we serve people with the population so dispersed? That's a great question. I think that anti-Semitism has been, I'm not sure if imprinted is the right word, but we feel it most keenly especially when we live in places where Jews are so dispersed. And whether we're talking about in Madison, where there might be 5,000 Jews, or we're talking about even small towns around here where Jews had lived for generations, very small communities. And a lot people really don't know. It's really interesting when I talk to my Christian colleagues, for example, they will ask me questions about Jewish practice, which they get from reading either the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. And they'll say, well, how do you do sacrifices, for example? Where do you perform these things? And I have to say to them, we don't do sacrifices anymore, that we actually have a whole set of literature, which because of the destruction of the city of Jerusalem almost 2,000 years ago, Judaism radically changed at that time, and Judaism has transmuted itself throughout the years. And so people, though, I think are looking at the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, and they say, oh, this is what Judaism is, and it isn't. So that's one of the things that I would say is there's just ignorance is the wrong word. It's just a not knowing really where to get the right information. Maybe people don't really understand what being part of a religious minority is like as well, because being part of a religious minority means that you do watch out for one another. You do keep one another close. You do celebrate holidays and life cycle events, and people might be interested or not, but they don't know enough as to where to answer. I would also say this, that I think that the Jewish community has gone by an axiom that's part of our ethical tradition, which is no less than our place and no more than our space. So we in America have striven to be good citizens. We've striven to follow the democratic values of this place. And we believe that makes everyone equal. And we don't want to, and we would think that everyone shares that ethos. And that's not always true. So we have to go with how do we balance one another's behaviors in our own community, no less than our place. We deserve to have our place in society among a lot of people, but we don't need more. So that's sort of another part of Jewish life that I think represents our sort of being quiet, being a little bit under the radar.
Allison, I have a Wisconsin Jewish experience story that I think kind of exemplifies some of the things that Rabbi Beitch was talking about. From 1997 to 2002, I played drums for the band Yid Vicious. Yid Vicious is the klezmer band in Madison. There was another one that was kind of out there when we started. Others have kind of come and gone. But yeah, so we played klezmer, which is, for people who are unfamiliar with the term, it's the Jewish music of Eastern Europe. In our case, it had like an electric guitar in there, so it wasn't like totally folk music, but it was in that spirit. And when I joined the band, I was one of 3 Jewish people in. So there were 7 people in the band, so it was majority non-Jewish. There were points in my history with the band, just in those 5 years, when there was always one other Jewish guy in there. Then I left, then he left. Currently, the band has no Jewish members. So I felt that was kind of interesting, that it's this Jewish music. And I was in the band. One of the things I started doing was the song announcements, because the people on the front line, like in front of the stage and not back with the rhythm section, they couldn't pronounce the Yiddish. And what was great was okay about that was that a lot of our gigs that we played, like in places around Madison and around the state, like nobody knew. But when we started playing for events sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies, there were people in the audience where when the person who was doing the announcements kind of butchered what the title of the song was, they said, "Fear the Machatum Lahem," and just like corrected them right there on the spot. I was mortified. But we played a lot of non-Jewish weddings, which I thought was fascinating. As my kids got older and I got more affiliated with the synagogue and got more observant, it got kind of difficult for me, because there was a couple wanted to get married in a little church outside of Lake Mills on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And I said, and so we're talking about the gig, and the band's like, "Should we do this?" And I said, "It's Rosh Hashanah." And they said, "Yeah, okay." And I'm like, "We can't play a wedding on Rosh Hashanah." And they're like, "Well, it's not a Jewish wedding." And I'm like, "That's not the issue. Like, I can't play a wedding on Rosh Hashanah. And it was just like this, it was like trying to have a conversation over a faulty Zoom link. It's just we could not communicate with each other what was going on. So I feel like the history of Yid Vicious is a great example of that. That in a lot of context, we were sort of seen as like exotic, which was like kind of fun and kind of not. But there was also a great deal of appreciation. I mean, I never felt like we were really being mocked. Like I don't recall a time where we ever had a hostile audience, or a drunk audience, maybe a little hostility there, but not in an anti-Semitic sense. But it was like a different reception for klezmer music and a different kind of way that people thought about klezmer music than if we played Jewish weddings in the New York metro area, if we were Maxwell Street klezmer out of Chicago, anything like that. So I feel like that was kind of it. There was a time we played it was like a folk dance group, this sort of like theme weekend around like an Eastern European Jewish wedding. And of course, as a historian, I was just like, are we talking like Hungary? Are we talking Lithuania? Are we talking Romania? These are different things. Like, never mind. It was all kind of Eastern Europe. And there was this whole kind of skit that came out, and I was writing back with the other Jewish member, and I said, I feel like they're kind of making fun of us. And he said, no, you're oversensitive. And then we get to the gig, and there's kids running around with like big fake beards on. And he was like, well, maybe. So anyway, my Wisconsin Jewish experience, part 2. Allison, what else you got for us?
Well, I want to say I love, if you guys are looking in the comments, there's like a whole bunch of folks talking about their own, Wisconsin Jewish experiences, whether it was in, at UW-Madison or in Milwaukee with their families. So those are great. And speaking of UW-Madison, I think it's important we talk about the chalk messages targeting Jewish student organizations that were, left across the UW-Madison campus on the first day of school last week. If folks watching aren't familiar with the situation, there's a great story up on the Cap Times website by our higher education reporter, Kayla. So check that out. But I think, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a bit about, anti-Semitic incidents and messaging that we see today, in Madison and across the state. So, Hannah, I guess if we can start with you, what was your response to this? I guess how are you feeling about it?
Well, I am a person that respects the First Amendment, which is what the university proclaimed was the reason they didn't speak out at the beginning. But I think bad speech calls for more good speech. And so when something like the chalk comments are happening on the first day of class, I think immediately the community at large should condemn it. The university leadership should have condemned it. And it certainly shouldn't have taken all the work and all the time that it took for that to happen. Am I surprised that happened? I wish I could tell you I am. I live in a completely different world that looks and sees anti-Semitism all over the place. People often say, Hannah, do you think is this like 1933? Is this like 1938? And oh, it is not. It is not, because the Jewish community has learned, I think the federation system is a great example, has learned how to organize, how to get messages out, but also how to look at what's happening through an ethical, moral, prophetic lens. And Rabbi, you are great at that. I love when the rabbi signs off on an email, you all should write him and see this. He talks about the fact that the synagogue is on a burial ground of the Native Americans. You touch their base, you touch their heart, and it builds a bond. And so the community relations field has been very, very important to Jewish survival, success, safety. When we look now, what recently happened not so recently, a few years ago, pre-pandemic, what happened in Pittsburgh, where a guy got, he was crazy, but he went in and he killed a lot of people. The largest anti-Semitic act of violence in our country's history. It didn't take more than an hour for all over the country, including here in Wisconsin, for there to be solidarity rallies, for there to be statements that are signed by religious leaders of all different faiths. And that's because we have leaders like Alan and like the rabbi who know how to reach out. They know how to speak their language. We're there for them, and when we need them, they're there for us. So it's a very different situation, but it doesn't mean it's good. It doesn't mean that people think in their horns or that people want to curse Jews for having disproportionate power and love the conspiracy theories and the code words. The code words now, of course, are the Rothschilds and Soros. And, there's so few Jews. Why do they have all this power? We have people who are elected into our highest offices who say the kind of things they'd scrawl with chalk. So it's symptomatic of a not good thing. The good news is we have a way to respond. The bad, which includes non-Jews. And the bad news is they're still crawling out from under their rocks.
Absolutely. Would anyone else like to just jump in? Either?
Yeah, I want to add something here because on the one hand, I have been inundated with messages from clergy from around the state, literally. Jews, non-Jews, people of color, you name it. I've been inundated the past day with messages of support from members of the clergy from around the state who heard about what was going on, who got an email that was circulated by me to Wisconsin Faith Voices of Justice, which is a vital organization in our community, particularly in a time like this. And I am heartened by the fact that they have responded so quickly and so strongly. And I'm sure over the next few days that will continue. But I remember when I was 5 in New Jersey and I experienced anti-Semitism and my mother had to protect me. And the idea that all of these years later, these things are still going on is so shocking to me. And it's shocking to me because not only for the Jewish community, today it's the Jewish community, and tomorrow it's the LGBTQ community, and the next day it's the Black community, whatever it is. And the level of hatred seems to have risen to a level that's acceptable, and it's not acceptable to me. This is not the world. This is not the Madison that I want for my granddaughter to grow up in. The idea that she would grow up in this, she's a year. The idea that she would grow up in this, to me, is symptomatic of a far greater ill in our society.
Another part of the not good aspect of the chalkings that Hannah referred to, and I really appreciate your not good term. I think that's a great technical term, but I think that what it is symptomatic of this broader movement in America of a far right, a supersessionist movement. People who are trying to declare that Jews, or perhaps other people as well, are trying to replace the white community in America with brown people. They use a term which to me is offensive. They use the term Great Replacement theory, but I wouldn't use the word theory. I would call it the Great Replacement delusion, because the word theory, I think, gives it a certain legitimacy that it doesn't deserve. And I think that thankfully, yet, we don't have, as there was in Nazi Germany, there wasn't government policy that led to anti-Semitism. However, I do fear that the rise of the white supersessionist movement, supremacist movement, wants to get people in office who want to suppress LGBTQ people. I think, thank you, Alan, for bringing that to the fore, and Black people and people of color and Asian Americans and Jews, Native and Indigenous peoples as well. I think that there is a movement, there is a trend that we have to watch and try and prevent, because I fear that moving forward.
Absolutely.
And when we have elected officials that mouth Christian nationalism, sometimes the silence that follows from their colleagues is deafening.
Yeah.
And it's tough, and it is not good. And it needs an energetic response.
Absolutely. Well, I think, we've got about 15 minutes left here. I would like to open this up to questions from folks in our audience here. So you can write those in the comment section, and I will try to get to some of them. But I'll start with one I saw a bit ago. Let's see if I can find it. I want to make sure I attribute it correctly. Deborah Leonard asked, is there a place in Madison for Jewish non-believers? And is this a growing demographic? So does anyone care to speak to that? Have an answer?
I will give I hope a brief answer, but to say that at least as far as following Jewish law is concerned, we have, technically speaking, in our business, we say we have 613 commandments that we find in the Hebrew Bible that show us what to do. One of them, maybe two, talks about belief. All the other commandments deal with behaviors. And I think what that signifies is that Jews believe a lot of different things, whether we talk about belief in God, belief about the authority of that 613 commandment kind of structure. We believe a lot of different things. I would estimate that in my community, maybe a quarter to a third of my members have serious doubts about the existence of deity, and yet they are still part of this Jewish community. So I think that there definitely is a place for non-believers, for Jewish non-believers.
I want to follow up on that, Rabbi. As a person who lives, as a Jewish person who lives in this community, I have felt that to be the case. And we have, the Jewish Federation happens to be kicking off a young leadership development program on the 28th of September. And we have 9 or 10 people in our cohort who are going to be part of this program. And one of the most exciting things is that their Jewish experience is all over. It's like this. And I think that's, it not only reflects the community of today, it reflects our community, but it also is what is going to make it such a rich experience, because there's going to be so much exchange. And I think Madison is certainly a community that supports that.
And I want to jump in on Alan's comments as an alumnus of the very program you just mentioned from, I think it was 2000, 2001 is when my wife and I were part of that. That was a point in my life where I was kind of minimally connected Jewishly. My kids were going to the Jewish preschool that Alan talked about, or they just come out of there. And I think that's another detail, is that Jewish people, like people of faith from lots of backgrounds, kind of go through different transitions. There are periods of time where I was like very distant from Judaism and really didn't hang out with a whole lot of Jewish people even. And there are other times in my life where I've been extremely connected. I think Madison, because it's the sort of place where a lot of people pass through. Our big private employer nowadays is Epic, which is legendary for employing people for a year or two before they move on and do something else. Sometimes those folks from Epic stay here. Other times they go on to other cities and countries. So because Madison is this kind of liminal space that people pass, that people come here for university, another one where it's like they're there a few years, maybe they stick around, maybe they don't. Then I think it's easy. I think there are a lot of people in Madison who are sort of searching for things, who are not super consistent with it. But if you look at people who've been in Madison for a long time, I think you'd see lots of, changing affiliation over time in terms of Jewish practice, in terms of connection to an organized Jewish community, and things of that nature. So I think that's another thing, going back to what makes, Madison different in Wisconsin, and it's kind of very Madison, about Madison Jewishness. I think that's a big part of it.
Absolutely. And this question comes from my dad, who is watching and commenting. And
we were all wondering that.
Yeah, you see the
I guess.
Garfield in the last name. It's not too hard to put together.
Kind of had to be. Yep.
But Brad Garfield asked, when it comes to religions that people don't know much about, how come Judaism seems to be the one religion that is often looked at with a negative view? I don't know if it's the one religion. Sorry, Dad. I'll push back a little bit because you're my dad. But I guess, does anyone have any thoughts on that? It's more of, I guess, a historical question. But I'd be curious to know, it seems to have persisted, right? We saw an incident last week of anti-Semitism in Madison. So along with why, I guess I'm curious to know about what folks can do who want to help make positive change, maybe.
Well,
That's a very hard question to answer. I'm sorry, Alan. Did you want to?
No, go ahead.
Right. I would say this. There's a passage in the book of Numbers where a prophet from an idolatrous nation was asked to curse the Israelites. And he couldn't curse the Israelites. He blessed them. But one of the curious things he did say was, in observing the community, he said, you are a people, or this is a people that is destined to be alone. And its future is to be alone. And this is not a historically based answer. But I think for some reason, the Jews, the Israelites, then the Jews, took that response that we are destined to be alone and said, all right, if this prophecy is true, if we are destined to be alone, so be it. Let us be alone. Let us be strong, and let us do what we need to do as a community. And frankly, the other part I would say is sometimes those 613 commandments I spoke to before speak to a lot of ethical and moral laws. And in the face of a lot of different peoples, we held tight to those laws, and we enforced those laws within us because we felt that was the moral and ethical thing to do. And sometimes I think that others don't like us for that. That's not historically accurate. That's just my feeling.
Alan?
Go ahead, Alan.
I was just going to say, what people can do, it seems very, very small, but what people can do is to stand up for right against wrong. What people can do is to say anti-Semitism is inappropriate, racial inequality is inappropriate, all of the above. When you hear about it, say something, do something, sign a letter, sign a petition, go to a demonstration, make your voice heard.
Absolutely. John, did you want to jump in at all?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was just going to say to Rabbi Beich, I mean, I think you weren't talking about a specific period of history, but I think that the history has kind of borne out what you're talking about. That if we're going back to Allison's dad's initial question about why are Jews singled out for anti-Semitism and so forth, it's been in a lot of ways, it's been like the Jewish tenacity. And it's been that the Jewish people have been able to hold on to Jewishness. And again, and that in itself is really complicated. I mean, as you talked about earlier, trying to define, okay, like what is Jewish? Is it kosher? Is it synagogue or temple membership? It's like, well, it's more than that. So being able to hold on to this identity through time, through space, through moving around much of the world, and still being able to come together. Like, there are a lot of people who don't quite get that. They're like, why is that happening? Like, how is that possible? I think anti-Semitism also looks different in different parts of the world. A lot of what we think of as like the rationales for anti-Semitism comes to us from Europe. Obviously, the indigenous peoples of the Americas had no concept of Jews or Jewishness for millennia, until roughly the year 1500 or so. So I think it's largely a European thing, and then countries that have a strong European influence is where we most often see anti-Semitism as we know it. Anti-Semitism looks a little different historically in the Middle East, although since the establishment of the State of Israel, that's been a huge spur to it, huge organizing issue that anti-Semites have glommed onto. So that's just expanding on my thoughts. Short version. Jonathan, I think you had a solid point. I wanted to embellish it a little bit.
I think it's really interesting that we've been on this program for 55 minutes, and that was the first time Israel was mentioned. And I think the population at large thinks that's all we care about. And, obviously it isn't. I do want to just say that this goes back to the first thing I spoke of, and that is this. It is anti-Semitism. It is not good, and it is growing and being normalized. And we're in a time right now, we're being told this every day, but it is true, that we give our sacred vote to people to represent us in halls of power at whatever level they're running. I think it is up to us and our allies to demand answers from the various candidates that ask us for our sacred vote. What are they going to do? Why didn't they speak out when Marjorie Huziwatz said that the fires in California are due to Jewish lightning strikes, laser beams? I mean, crazy stuff. And as the growth of Christian nationalism, and that's what they call themselves, so I use their language, but as it's happening, we should be asking people, I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican, well, I do, but never mind, that we need to ask people, what do they think about this? Do they understand that minority religions find this extremely painful and foreboding? And I can't have a microphone without urging that I know Jews vote, we vote in record numbers. Let's be strategic and demanding in giving our sacred vote.
That seems like a good note to end on to me. Well, thank you all so much to our audience for taking the time to tune in and to watch. And a huge thank you to our amazing panelists here. You all are extremely smart and kind people, and I'm better for having been able to talk with you for an hour. There are a few questions people had that I don't think they got answered. I urge you to reach out to these folks, look them up, find them, email them, call them, whatever you want, and have longer discussions about all of this. There's only so much we can cover in an hour here, and it's a big, important topic. But again, thank you all so much for taking the time to speak to this large group of people. Thank you again to our sponsor for theater, and make sure you check out the rest of Cap Times Idea Fest 2022. We've got, I think, 5 more days of great panels and events, so check them out. And thank you all so much. Have a great evening.
You too.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for coming.